It doesn't look like fear. It doesn't look like defeat. It doesn't even look like weakness, at least not on the surface. In fact, it often disguises itself as maturity, honesty, openness, a desire to clear things up. But in that exact moment, when you rush to explain yourself, you begin to lose ground. You hand something precious to the other person, the right to decide whether your explanation is good enough. And that right quickly becomes power. Because the moment you keep defending yourself, you're no longer standing in the center of your position. You're standing in someone else's courtroom. The history of power, psychology, and human relationships has always known one harsh truth. The second you start desperately proving you're right, you've already partly lost. Not because you're wrong. Not because explanations are always bad. But because the form of defense often hides a concession. An excuse rarely sounds like strength. It sounds like a request. Please believe me. Please don't think worse of me. Please don't take away your approval. And the person hearing it, even if they don't consciously realize it, feels the roles shift. One becomes the judge. The other becomes the defendant. One holds the high ground. The other tries to climb up to it. This is exactly the kind of dynamic Machiavelli understood when he wrote about power, not as a moral fairy tale, but as a real, brutal system of human behavior. He knew that in a world driven by fear, ambition, resentment, envy, and control, perception often matters more than intention. It's not enough to be right. It's not enough to be honest. You have to understand how your behavior is read by others. People don't evaluate only the content of your words. They read your posture, your tone, your pace, your hesitation, your anxiety, your inner stability. And when someone starts defending themselves too early, too much, too emotionally, they send one of the strongest signals of subordination. I depend on your verdict. Why is this so powerful? Because the human brain is hypersensitive to hierarchy. We can talk about equality and rationality all day, but deep down, we constantly scan for status signals. Who stays calm when they're questioned? Who doesn't scramble when pressure rises? Who doesn't flood the room with words when suspicion appears? That person is perceived as grounded. And the opposite is just as true. The person who instantly rushes to explain often looks like someone afraid of consequences, even if, in reality, they're simply terrified of being misunderstood. That's the paradox. Many honest, deep people lose, not because they're weaker in truth, but because their anxiety makes them behave like they're lower in rank. They're easy to push into defense mode. Press the guilt button. Trigger the fear of judgment. Touch the old wound of rejection, and suddenly they're explaining more than necessary. They talk longer than needed. They reveal details no one asked for. They don't just justify an action, they justify their right to exist. And every extra sentence doesn't restore power. It shows how far they've already stepped away from it. A person who keeps defending themselves often believes they're fighting for truth. But in many cases, they're actually fighting for acceptance. Those are not the same thing. Truth doesn't always require urgency. Acceptance almost always does. And that's where the trap forms. If you explain from inner calm, briefly, clearly, without self-humiliation, that's one kind of communication. But if you explain because you can't tolerate the idea that someone might think poorly of you, you're no longer speaking from strength. You're speaking from lack. Your words are driven not by reason, but by fear. And fear almost never sounds convincing. Machiavelli was uncomfortable precisely because he spoke without decoration. He didn't write about how people should be. He wrote about how they behave when power, survival, and control are at stake. His message was simple and ruthless. In the world of influence, you cannot constantly display dependence on other people's approval, because the person who needs constant justification becomes predictable, and the predictable person becomes controllable. Look at how this plays out in everyday life. A manager asks sharply why a task wasn't done on time. One employee starts rambling. Too many emails, complicated week, other people didn't respond, the system crashed, problems at home, they tried, but it didn't work out. Another employee says calmly, the deadline was missed. Here's why. Here's what I already fixed. Here's what happens next. Technically, both gave an explanation. Psychologically, they stood in two completely different positions. The first sounds like they're asking for a reduced sentence. The second remains the agent. The first drowns in defense. The second holds the frame. The same thing happens in relationships. When one person constantly has to justify every decision, every delay, every pause, every mood, a quiet imbalance forms. One becomes the judge. The other becomes the person under endless inspection. If this lasts long enough, love starts mixing with control. And the most dangerous part, people often label this care or honesty. But when you must constantly prove you're not guilty, you're no longer living in intimacy, you're living in interrogation. And then there are social media. We live in an era where self-justification has become a collective ritual. People explain their boundaries, their choices, their mistakes, their exhaustion, their silence, their success, even their happiness. They're afraid that if they don't immediately explain, someone will invent the worst version of events. And sometimes they will. But the deeper problem is this: constant public explanation creates internal dependence on the audience. A person no longer feels they have the right to simply exist. They feel they must narrate their existence. Strong people don't stay silent because they don't care. And they don't stay silent because they're always right. They stay silent, or speak less, because they understand something crucial. Not every attack deserves an answer. Not every doubt deserves a stage. Not every provocateur deserves access to your nervous system. Because defense isn't just words. It's attention. And attention is a resource. When someone forces you to justify yourself, they're often forcing you to spend energy inside their frame instead of acting inside yours. That's why people who crave control love putting others into defense mode. It's one of the oldest power tricks in history. They don't need to defeat you with facts. They just need to make you nervous and explain yourself. They don't need to prove you guilty. They just need you to behave as if guilt is possible. They don't need to destroy your reputation. They just need to plant enough fear of judgment that you start dismantling yourself with extra words. And here's another danger. When you defend yourself, you often expand the accusation. You give details no one asked for. You reveal weak spots no one would have noticed. You strengthen the opponent because you supply the material. It's like someone lights a small fire, and in panic, you pour gasoline made of your explanations. Your anxiety turns a minor doubt into a major scene. But does this mean you should never explain yourself? No. And this is where we have to avoid the opposite extreme. There's a difference between responsibility and self-humiliation. There's a difference between clarity and excuses. There's a difference between adult ownership and desperate image management. A strong person can say, "Yes, I made a mistake. Yes, this is my responsibility. Yes, here's what I'm doing next." But they don't kneel before someone else's endless need to test their worth. That's the difference between inner strength and psychological dependence. Inner strength lets you admit failure without collapsing. Dependence makes you justify yourself even when your guilt isn't proven or doesn't exist at all. One position says, "I can't the truth about myself." The other screams, "Please don't reject me." And people feel the difference far more than we think. Think about how often in your life someone tried to put you in that position. Maybe as a child you were forced to prove you didn't have bad intentions. Maybe misunderstandings instantly became interrogations. Maybe you weren't just asked what happened. You were made to feel your value depended on the quality of your defense. If so, then the habit of constant explanation might not be communication style. It might be an old survival strategy. You explain not because you want to. You explain because once, it was the only way to avoid shame, punishment, or emotional abandonment. And this is where Machiavelli's psychology intersects with personal trauma. Because a person who cannot tolerate disapproval is extremely easy to control. All it takes is a hint that they look selfish, rude, dangerous, disloyal, and they will immediately rush to prove the opposite. They will reveal their cards. They will surrender their center. They will accept the other person's rules, just to remain good and acceptable. That's why many power systems, from toxic families to political regimes, don't rely only on direct force. They rely on the constant demand for self-justification. People are made to feel perpetually guilty, always potentially wrong, always needing to explain, correct, confirm, earn. In that atmosphere, inner freedom disappears. A person begins living in anticipation of accusation. They've done nothing, and they're already preparing arguments for their defense. And it's exhausting, because constant self-justification is psychological life under conditional threat. It's like carrying an invisible tribunal inside you. You become your own prosecutor, defense attorney, and defendant. You edit yourself before you even speak. You pre-write explanations for why you said no, why you didn't reply, why you're tired, why you changed your mind, why you want to be alone, why you have boundaries. Slowly, you lose contact with the simple right to exist without permission. Machiavelli, strangely enough, was not teaching cruelty for cruelty's sake. He was teaching the ability to see the real mechanics of power. He understood, if you don't control the form of your presence, someone else will. If you don't decide what you will and won't explain, another person's hunger for access will decide for you. If you can't tolerate being misunderstood, you will become a slave to any audience that threatens judgment. This is why silence is sometimes not avoidance, but power. Not coldness, but self-control. Not indifference, but refusal to feed someone else's game. Silence doesn't always mean weakness. Often weakness is the inability to be silent, the inability to hold a pause, to withstand a false impression without urgently trying to fix it. A person who cannot survive being misjudged is easy to buy with a hint of disapproval. Of course, none of this means you should become a cold manipulator who never explains anything and hides behind a mask of superiority. That posture can also be fear in disguise. Real strength is not always staying silent. Real strength is choosing when to speak, how much to speak, and from what internal place you speak. If you explain from dignity, that's power. If you explain from panic, that's surrender. Imagine someone hears an accusation and pauses. They don't rush. They don't flail. They don't throw out 10 details. They don't desperately try to restore their good image. They first assess whether the other person is a partner or a provocateur, whether there is room for truth or only a trap for reaction. They don't answer inside a wrong frame. Because they know, sometimes the most important move is not proving yourself within someone else's script, but refusing the script entirely. This is one of the deepest shifts in the psychology of power. Don't respond inside a frame you didn't choose. If someone questions you for control, excessive explanation deepens the control. If someone provokes you for destabilization, defense reveals where they can hook you. If someone devalues you not through facts but through dominance, logic will never convince someone who isn't seeking truth. And here's another uncomfortable reality. Many people respect not the one who gave the best explanation, but the one who didn't lose themselves under pressure. It may feel unfair, but it's real. People are not as rational as they think. They respond to your nervous system, to presence, to your ability to hold tension without self-destruction. Sometimes a few calm sentences shift the balance more than 10 minutes of brilliant arguments. The person who constantly defends themselves fears being misunderstood. And yes, that can happen. But something worse happens too. You begin to look like someone without a center. Because the person who over-explains announces to the world, "My inner authority is not enough, I need external confirmation." And then the world quickly produces people who are happy to sell you that confirmation in small doses, in exchange for control. Watch how it works in manipulative relationships. A partner says, "If you have nothing to hide, you can explain." It sounds reasonable, almost innocent. But if behind it is not true curiosity, but a demand for constant access, it becomes a trap. You begin to live as if your transparency is never enough. You explain everything, clarify everything, prove everything. The other person slowly expands the boundaries of acceptable control. That is not intimacy. That is training. The same happens in toxic workplaces. There's always an invisible rule. You must not only perform, you must emotionally prove loyalty. Not just do the task, show the correct attitude. Not just have boundaries, explain them politely enough to make others comfortable. And if you try to be understandable to everyone, you almost inevitably lose respect from those who feed on your compliance. So what is the ancient law of the strong? Not cruelty, not cynicism, not permanent silence. It's this. You do not hand your inner legitimacy to other people. You do not let anyone who raises their voice decide whether you have the right to your position. You do not rush to save your reputation in the eyes of someone who has already decided to see you as guilty. You do not prove your value to someone who treats you like a suspect. You remember that dignity is not something someone gives you after a perfect speech. Dignity is the place you speak from. And here's the interesting part. When you stop desperately defending yourself, the entire field around you changes. Provocateurs lose power. Manipulators look for easier targets. People who genuinely want to understand you begin speaking differently. And you realize how much energy you were spending maintaining other people's illusions about you. You regain silence. You regain pause. You regain the right not to comment on every strike. This won't happen in a day, especially if defending yourself became part of your personality. At first, it will feel anxious. Silence will feel like a crime. You'll feel that if you don't explain, you'll be hated. That if you don't soften your position, you'll be seen as cold or arrogant. But often, this is just withdrawal from an old dependency. You're not becoming worse. You're simply becoming less convenient for people who relied on keeping you in defense mode. And this is where real maturity begins. The ability to speak a short truth. The ability to admit a mistake without self-erasure. The ability not to react to provocation designed only to make you collapse. The ability to distinguish who you genuinely owe an explanation to and who you don't. Because not every question is legitimate. Not every need for clarity is innocent. Not every accusation deserves your nervous system. And perhaps that is one of the hardest forms of power in the modern world. Not the power to defeat everyone, but the power to remain yourself when someone tries to force you to justify your right to be. To stop proving the obvious to those who benefit from doubting it. To stop offering your heart where people are only searching for levers. To stop chasing approval where approval is used as currency. Machiavelli saw power as a game of perception, fear, decisiveness, and timing. And even though his world was centuries ago, the principles still cut sharply today. Because power is not only thrones and governments. Power is the office, the home, the comments section, the audience, the family, the relationship, the boundary, the self-worth. It's who defines the frame of the conversation, who decides what is normal, who has to prove themselves, and who simply speaks, who has the right to pause, and who fears that pause the most. If you want to see where your power leaks, ask yourself a simple question. Who do I over-explain myself to? Where do I justify more than feels right? In what relationships can't I simply speak briefly and stop? Where do I talk not to clarify, but to avoid losing acceptance? The answers may sting, but that's often where your deepest submission is hiding. And maybe the most important lesson is this. Strength doesn't begin when no one attacks you. Strength begins when someone else's attack no longer automatically triggers your need to prove your worth. When you no longer live on the terms of someone else's doubt. When your truth is not born from panic. When your boundaries don't require a 10-page explanation. When you reclaim the right to be concise. The person who endlessly justifies themselves slowly loses shape. The person who can respond from their center, even while admitting mistakes, keeps their power. And that's the entire difference. Not perfection. Not flawlessness. Not coldness. But whether you still belong to yourself under pressure. Sometimes the strongest answer isn't a long defense, but a calm sentence. Sometimes the strongest position isn't winning the argument, but refusing the humiliating role. Sometimes the strongest move is stopping the attempt to prove what is already obvious to those who can see, and will never be enough for those who decided not to. So remember this. The moment you feel that burning urge to immediately explain everything, stop. A pause can save more than arguments. Calm can say more than a speech. And dignity often begins exactly where the habit of self-justification ends. If you're drawn to themes like this, dark psychology of power, influence, fear, manipulation, and inner strength, subscribe to Perpetual Echoes. Here, we don't just talk about human nature. We learn to see it.